A little while ago, this little magazine called Time Magazine came out with a list of the 100 best fantasy books of all time. And there was a lot of weird things about that list, and a lot of people reacted to it, but I never reacted to it because I saw all of the videos and I already knew the list by the time I realized this was a thing. So it just felt weird to do a reaction video to a list that I already knew all of the books on. But there were some really weird things about that list, from the fact that there were sometimes multiple books from one series or from one author in it, but other authors were left out completely, and then somehow the Mortal Instruments made their way onto the list, which I don't know about all of you guys, but when I read the Mortal Instruments, that's when I decided I was too old for YA, and that was back when I was still a teenager. So yeah, there were a lot of weird things about that list, but especially when I'm in reading slumps, I occasionally like to search top fantasy books of all time just to see if there's another series that could be a new favorite of mine overall. And I found this list. It's by Esquire magazine. Now, I have not looked at the books on this list. It came out back in March of this year, so I'm a few months late, but I did see the first book on this list, and I already know it's gonna be a great list. Not in a good way. I'm hoping that it's not horrible, but I already know the 50th best book or whatever that's on this list, and I don't agree that it should be on a list of best books of all time. So I feel like this might be a fun list to react to, and hopefully we can get some good content out of this. So this is from Esquire magazine, the 50 best fantasy books of all time. We'll see how this goes. I guess I should have realized the 10 books or so here that it shows that I probably wouldn't like this list very much, because out of those, the only one that I actually like is The Night Circus, and I like it for nostalgic reasons and because it has beautiful writing, but I objectively know it's not that great of a book. Like, the only thing it has going for it is the writing, so we'll see. Hopefully it gets better. So number 50, we of course have City of Brass, which is a book that I have read and I really did not like. I gave this book 2 stars, and I did try to reread it at some point, I think in the last year, because I wanted to read the next books in the series because I've heard they're better, but I couldn't reread it. Like, I just DNF'd it very quickly into it. It's not because I don't think the idea is a good idea. I actually really love the idea because it's a book set in 18th century Cairo, and it's a fantasy book, and it's about jinn, which is just really cool, but I think the execution of it just so did not work for me. I really hated the main character. I think that's the main thing. I just really hated the main character, who was just so in her own head, and just the way it was. Like, I don't mind internal monologue if the internal monologue tells me something more about the character than what their actions and their dialogue say. But in this case, I feel like it didn't tell me more. It was just a repetition of what their actions and dialogue was saying, so it was just a waste of my time. So, love the idea of City of Brass, really hate the execution of it. So let's see what number 49 is. Oh, it's The Night Circus. I already kind of talked about this a little bit. I love The Night Circus, by the way. It is a 5-star book for me. I absolutely love it. Would not be on my list of best fantasy books of all time, though. Maybe on the top 50 list, just because I don't think I've read that many great books. This, I think I'm okay with it coming in at 49. If you haven't read The Night Circus, highly recommend the audiobook. I absolutely love the audiobook, and it's just such beautiful writing, and the audiobook narrator is Jim Dale, so he just brings the book to life. But I don't love the characters. They're morally ambiguous characters, which I generally love, but I just felt never attached to them. I honestly think that the ending, the plot, is anticlimactic, but I love the writing so much that it's one of those audiobooks that I could just listen to like anytime, and it doesn't even have to be the whole audiobook. I could just listen to a part of it and be happy to be listening to it. So I'm okay with it being on the list. It might be on my favorite fantasy books of all time, but I feel like if I worked at like a magazine or something like that, and there were a lot of people that were putting in favorite fantasy books of all time, this is not one of the ones that I would recommend personally. Okay, The Buried Giant. I have not read that one, but I've heard really good things about the author. I've wanted to read some of his books, but I haven't read any of them yet, so I can't really say anything about that one. The Library at Montchar. I haven't read this one either. It doesn't even look like a fantasy book to me, though. Oh, like the library grants some special powers, so I guess it's kind of like a paranormal book, so we'll give that one a pass. Ring Shout. This is a book that I've wanted to read. It's on my TBR, but I haven't read either, so I can't say anything about it. Wow, there's so many ads. The Other City, I haven't read this one either. It looks interesting, but it also kind of looks more, it doesn't look like a fantasy book either. It looks like a literary fiction book, which literary fiction can have speculative elements to it, but I don't know. The Sorcerer of Wild Deeps. This is not a great list for me just because I'm not recognizing like any of these books. Let's keep going. Haven't read that one. Haven't read that one. Have not read that one. What Should Be in the Wild? I've thought about reading this a few times, but then was just like, no, it doesn't sound like something I'd be interested in, so just haven't read that one either. A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab. I have read this one. This was the first book that I picked up because of BookTube, and it was probably one of the only books that I picked up only because of BookTube, because I hated it so much. I hated it so much. And I think I hate it more because it calls itself an adult book, and it just reminded me so much of YA. I'm not saying it is a YA book, because you can definitely write books for adults who typically read YA, but I was expecting more from it, more world building and things like that from it that I would expect from like adult fantasy, and I just did not get it from this book. It just annoyed me and frustrated me more than anything, and the characters annoyed me and frustrated me more than anything, both the world building characters, and then the plot was actually the only thing that made me want to potentially continue on with the series. But yeah, no, I did not like that one. It would actually be on my list of worst fantasy books of all time. So yeah, no, I don't think it fits on this list. Well, it might fit on this list, but it wouldn't fit on an actual best fantasy books of all time list. Have not read that one. Tagana! Okay, finally a good one. I love Tagana. It's a deeply political fantasy, and there's actually not that much like magic in it. Like, it almost feels like historical fiction, but I still love it. Like, I would agree with this one. This one would be on a best fantasy books of all time. Beautiful writing, by the way. Absolutely beautiful writing. I love the audiobook because the audiobook narrator is fantastic. I love everything about this book. So yeah, agree with this one. Tides of Black Heaven. Have not heard of it. A Game of Thrones! This is one of my favorite fantasy books of all time. So okay, this list gets a little bit better. I'm kind of okay with this list now. It included one of my favorite fantasy books of all time, so like, it's better now. In case you guys didn't know, I don't talk about the series at all on my channel, basically, but you might get more content for this series in the future just because it is one of my favorite fantasy series of all time. I think it's like, it's one of the hardest series that I've ever read, but also one of the most rewarding, if that makes sense. The Subtle Knife by Philip Pullman. I do like his Dark Materials. I wouldn't call it a favorite series of mine, but I have read the trilogy and I did really enjoy it. So I can see it on a list like this. The Queen of the Conquered by Casey Calendar. So this is on my TBR. I have the Kindle version of this. I actually bought it like a long time ago because someone from BookTube recommended it. I don't even remember who now, but it's on my like Kindle TBR to read it. So hopefully I can get to it at some point. It's a beautiful cover though. I absolutely love that cover. Alpa Imperial by Angelica Gorstadischer. I don't know how to pronounce her name. Haven't heard of it. Stardust. I have not read this one, I don't think. I've seen the movie for Stardust, but I haven't read it. I do have the physical book. Neil Gaiman, unfortunately, is an author that I just don't get. Like, I've read quite a few books by him at this point. I've read American Gods, which was the first book that I read by him, because it was like kind of in the realm of the type of books that I would read, but I just really didn't like it. After that, I read a bunch of his other books, and I think the only one that I'm just like, I kind of like is the Graveyard Book because it's middle grade and I love middle grade. But Stardust is one that I haven't read yet because I saw the movie and I really didn't care for the movie, and I didn't really care for any of Neil Gaiman's other work, so that's why I haven't read this one yet. The Blue Fox. Have not heard of this one, but it sounds interesting. Icelandic priest in 1883 who tracks down a blue fox. How is this fantasy? This does not look like fantasy at all. Maybe it's like magical realism? I don't know. The Mountain, Where the Mountain Meets the Moon by Grace Lynn. I feel like I might like like this. I haven't read this one. I've seen the picture of it before and I've considered reading it, but I really don't know anything about it. It's an award winner though, so that's good. Maybe I will pick that one up. Get in Trouble, never heard of it. Redemption in Indigo. I've heard of this one. It's on my list of books to read, but I really haven't gotten to it yet. I've heard really great things about Redemption in Indigo and Karen Lloyd in general though. Foundry Side by Robert Jackson Bennett. I actually really like Foundry Side. I wouldn't say that I like it more than Game of Thrones, but I do really like Foundry Side. Really great magic system, really interesting characters, and I love the plot, especially in the first book. So good book to have on this list. Moon Witch Spider King. I understand why it's on this list. I really do. This is a book that I recently DNF'd. And honestly, I was not planning to pick up Moon Witch Spider King because I knew how much I didn't like Black Leopard Red Wolf. I liked it, but I didn't like it because I think it was very, very well written. Both of these, I think they're very, very well written books, but they're incredibly dark and I really don't like the content of the books. And I was really hoping that I might like Moon Witch Spider King better than Black Leopard Red Wolf, but that did not happen. So yeah. Ooh. Even though like objectively it's very well written, entertainment wise, it's very, very difficult to read. The Drowned Life, never heard of it. Uprooted. I can't. Uprooted with it. Naomi Novik is another one of those authors I have difficulty with, and Uprooted is one of hers that I straight up DNF'd. So yeah. The Bird King, never heard of it. The Changeling by Victor Lavelle. So this is a book that's on my TBR to read at some point. I've been meaning to read it for the last like 3 years and just haven't gotten around to it. Mostly because like I don't have access to it. I should probably just buy it, but I wanted to read the audiobook for it because it feels like the type of book that I'd really like on audio because it has kind of like that spooky vibe, or at least I assume that it does based off of like the title and the book cover, which I guess you shouldn't go off of those things, but whatever, it's fine. I will get to this one eventually, but I don't know yet. Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. Great pay. I do like The Way of Kings a lot. It's probably not one of my favorite series of all time. Well, it might be. Let's see how the series goes and we'll decide later. It's still very much in the early stages, so haven't decided that one on yet. The Shadow Rising by Robert Jordan. Book 4? Why did they choose book 4? Out of all of the Wheel of Time books, they chose book 4? I don't know why they chose this one. I mean, it's not a bad book at all. Like, I think the book is perfectly fine. I love the Wheel of Time series, by the way, in case you couldn't realize that. But book 4 just seems like an odd choice. Now, I wouldn't choose book 1, 2, or 3, but book 4 still just seems like a really odd choice. I would pick probably something further down the line, but I do think the Wheel of Time series belongs on lists like these, so I'm happy they included that. Ozma of Oz. Have not read it. I honestly have not read The Wizard of Oz either. Like, I've seen the movie, and I feel like that's enough. Like, I don't feel like a need to read the books, if that makes sense. Have not heard of that one. Have not heard of that. C.S. Lewis. Oh, it's part of the Chronicles of Narnia. Then I have heard of it. Oops. I read the Chronicles of Narnia when I was little, and I did not love them. I think I only liked them because other people were reading them, but like every time I think back to it, the less and less I like the series. So I can see why the Chronicles of Narnia would be on one of these lists. Personally, it's not one of my favorites though. I've heard about this one, The Palm Wine Drinkard. I've never read it though. I've heard about it. I don't think it's on my TBR currently, but I might add it to it. Have not heard of that one. Have not heard of that one. There's just so many books. The Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. I don't know if this is fantasy. I guess it could be fantasy. I absolutely love Kindred. I don't think it's like my favorite book by Butler, but I definitely think Butler deserves to be on lists like these. And she doesn't have a lot of like books that you would consider fantasy. Most of her books are more on the sci-fi side of things, but I absolutely love Butler, and this is probably the closest to fantasy that she has. And I feel like this is the type of book that is a tale that needs to be told, because I feel like there are tons of like time travel books out there that glorify the past, and Butler does the exact opposite in the best way possible, and I just absolutely love her. So I definitely agree with this one. Children of Blood, I do not agree with Children of Blood and Bone. I actually have read this one, and I was really excited to read it too. Like, I bought this book when it was brand new. Like, when it first came out, when it was first released, and I was like, I'm so excited to read this. And then, like, all of the reviews started coming out, and I was just like, maybe I'm not as excited to read this as I thought I was. But then I did finally give it a go, and was very disappointed by it. I like some things about it, but I liked two of the characters. Two of the characters I liked, two of the characters I really didn't like, and then I didn't like the plot. The plot annoyed the crap out of me, and because of that, I have not continued on with the series, and I think I unhauled my book for Children of Blood and Bone too. Like, I bought, like, the hardcover when it first got released, so spent money on that thing, and yeah, I was really disappointed by this one, so no, would not include this on my list of best fantasy of all time. Have not heard about that one. Circe by Madeline Miller. I don't really think of this book as fantasy. I understand why people do, just because it's a retelling of Greek mythology, which is of course the story of Circe. I love this book. So good. I do think it's a little forgettable though, but in my mind, I read it more like historical fiction than fantasy, which is kind of like weird because it's not historical fiction. It definitely has fantasy elements to it, but that's just in my mind how I think of it. So I love the book, and I think it's a great book, but I personally don't really consider it fantasy. So yeah, I wouldn't put it on one of these lists, but I still really love it. Have not heard about that one. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. So this one has been on my TBR for a while. I don't know when I'm gonna get to it because it is a ginormous book. I actually have the physical book too. I can see why it's on a list like this. I see it on lists like this all the time. So the next one is A Hero Born. So I've heard a lot about this book, and like I guess it's a series of books now. I guess it's a first volume in a trilogy. I have not read it, but it's one that I'm really interested in reading. Who Fears Death? I have heard about this one. I have not read it. It's on my list, TBR, to read as well. Hopefully it ends up being amazing, but I have not read it yet. The Grace of Kings. See, it's really interesting that The Grace of Kings is number 4 on this list, because The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu reminds me a lot of The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. Not just in their names, because their names do sound very similar, but it might be because I read them around the same time, but they're structured very similarly because they're both these military fantasies, and I actually really like The Way of Kings a lot more than The Grace of Kings, which is why I probably haven't continued on with The Grace of Kings yet. I had planned to do it this year. I planned to continue on with that series, but I just haven't gotten around to it, and I think part of it is because I like the Stormlight Archive so much more, and these are just so similar. So it kind of annoys me that it's number 4 on this list. That's really high, and it's honestly kind of boring to read. Like, it's like a worse version of The Way of Kings, in my opinion. I mean, it's still good, don't get me wrong. I just didn't like the lack of female characters also, which kind of annoyed me. I heard that kind of gets fixed a little bit in the later books, but it's kept me back from reading the rest of the series so far. So this is another one that, like, to me, it's a solid 3-star read, so would not make a best fantasy book list to me. Earthsea, A Wizard of Earthsea. I don't remember if I've read the first book. I think I've DNF'd the first book multiple times. Not because I don't want to read it, because I definitely do want to read it. And I've actually bought like the compendium of this entire series. It's on my list that I definitely will read at some point just because so many people love this series, but I haven't read it yet. But I can see why it belongs on a list like this. I love Ursula K. Le Guin, by the way. Love her. So I definitely want to read her big fantasy series. It's gonna happen at some point. Lord of the Rings. Okay, I completely agree. Lord of the Rings should definitely be on this list. Honestly, I feel like it should be number 1. So like, it kind of surprises me that it's not number 1, because a lot of lists like this, Lord of the Rings is number 1. Personally, it's not my favorite fantasy series of all time, but I can see why people include it as part of their favorites. So I like that it's on here. And number 1 is the 5th season. Interesting. Not gonna lie, this surprises me that it's a 5th season, because, I mean, I like the 5th season, don't get me wrong. I love the Broken Hearts trilogy, but I feel like there's a lack of warmth in the series that takes away from my entertainment value of it. It's much more of a serious sort of series to me that I feel like we're supposed to learn something from, and I think you do, but to me, the reason why I read is for the entertainment value. And if I learn something along the way, great. If I don't, as long as I'm entertained, I'm happy. And I feel like the 5th season, the Broken Earth trilogy in general, like it's more on the serious side. And while there are parts of it that I feel like I do start getting more entertainment value out and more warmth from, especially like parts with like Alabaster and that sort of relationship that I thought was very interesting and like complex in an interesting way, I honestly don't think that I would have it in like my top 10 favorite fantasy of all time or anything like that, or even like my top, well, it might be on my top 50, but I definitely wouldn't put it as number 1. So that's why it's an interesting choice to me. I think they should have at least switched Lord of the Rings and the 5th season. Like, I feel like those should at least be switched. Because even though I probably like the Broken Earth trilogy more than Lord of the Rings just because personal taste, I would think that the majority of people out there would like Lord of the Rings more, if that makes sense. So yeah, I don't know. This was kind of a weird list. It wasn't as bad as I was expecting based off of the first one. So I'm actually a little bit happier with this list than I was expecting to be, but I feel like there are like some notable ones missing. Like for example, the Harry Potter series doesn't make this list, but at the same time, His Dark Materials and the Chronicles of Narnia do make the list, which just seems like a weird coincidence because to me, objectively, the Harry Potter series is significantly better than either of those. I can understand why they might not want to associate with that series right now, though. And then there were definitely a lot of high fantasy series that I just feel like should have been on this list. There's a ton of high fantasy series out there that like I always think should be on the best fantasy of all time lists, and they just never are, so it's a whole thing. But I hope that was an interesting video. I don't know if it honestly was. I had a fun time with it though, so I hope you guys enjoyed it too. I'm posting videos every Sunday, so consider subscribing. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up to support my channel. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.